So say you're up late at night on your favorite online marketplace, and you're looking for cool stuff, just seeing what's out there, and you act impulsively. You click buy it now and uh-oh, what do you do now? I know, total hypothetical. It's never happened to any of us ever, especially in photography, right? Right? Uh-oh. Hey there, and welcome to Large Format Friday. I'm your host, Matt Marrash, and if this is the first time you're stopping by the channel, here's a playlist of all of our episodes in Season 2 of LFF. And if you haven't subscribed yet, each and every Friday, we tackle something new in the world of large format photography. Today, I'm gonna see if I can fit this on this. Is that even possible? Stay tuned. So a couple months back, I did an in-depth video talking about these things, barrel lenses. Lenses that are big and without shutters. Sometimes they're used for copy cameras, process cameras, and sometimes they were just designed for really big old large format cameras like this guy here. This lens is a Graf Variable. We'll get into more to like the nitty-gritty on the lens a little bit later, but I was intrigued by it until I realized when it got here just how massive it is. I really think that I might have a problem on my hands because the camera systems I use a Sinar style lens board, which is just short of 150 millimeters wide. Am I gonna be able to even get this monster on this square lens board? Well, before we get to that, let's talk about options I have. In the past, when I've received a lens that wasn't mounted into a shutter, we needed a few things to attach a barrel lens to a lens board. One of the most common ones, and thankfully this lens came with it, is a lens flange. This is going to be a threaded ring that's going to allow us to physically mount the lens to the board. It's going to give us an attachment point that threads onto the lens. A previous lens that I'd received and had professionally mounted was my Ilex portrait lens, which prior to getting this monster, I thought, man, this is a pretty big size lens. This one was actually not a bad fit onto a Sinar lens board. There's plenty of excess space. So this lens actually didn't come with a flange, so I sent this off to SK Grimes in the northeastern part of the United States, where they custom machined this lens board solution and a custom made flange so I can rotate this barrel lens in and out of this lens board. And they did a really professional job and it was super solid. So about 100 and change later, and a couple weeks of waiting, I had my lens board solution. So when you have a lens and you have a flange for that lens, you have a few different options. You can have a professional machinist that's good at lens boards and mounting to get it onto there, but you're gonna be without your lens for several weeks, plus the price of custom machining. If you have a friend who has custom machining tools like a CNC lathe, or they're just really good with their hands, that's another option. And I also found there are some dealers on eBay that will custom thread a lens board. So they're CNC carving out threads into a lens board. So it's a single machined piece that fits your standard lens board that also kind of acts as a flange. And that's another option which, while not expensive, takes a considerable amount of time because it's typically coming from overseas. As I started doing a little bit of keyboard research and checking forums and other places, I did find one person on the large format forum who claimed that there is enough meat, enough space on one of these lens boards to fit this behemoth Graf Variable lens onto the board. And when I started obtaining quotes for custom machining on this, I said, you know what? Maybe it's worth giving it a shot. Hey there, and welcome to Poking Around with Power Tools. I'm your host, Matt Marrash, and today we're gonna see if we can DIY this onto this. I've got the tools it needs to happen. Do I recommend this? If you consider yourself handy or you have a CNC lathe, go for it. I'm gonna use this with some more accessible tools, so if you're a homeowner and you have your standard arrangement of power tools, it's surprisingly easy to make this happen, but we do need to take a little bit of effort. I'm gonna go over the tools that we're gonna use for today's DIY. Okay, so for today's DIY, we're gonna need our big old lens. We're gonna need the lens board that we're going to machine this to fit. This can be undrilled or pre-drilled, that should be fine. We'll need the flange because that's what we're gonna be cutting out the hole to fit in. We're gonna need a tape measure, a hammer, 8" half round file, some vice grips, a flathead and a Phillips head screwdriver, compact power drill, impact driver, 4 3/4 inch hole saw with a starter arbor attachment that fits it in, some 1.5 inch screws, a bit for those screws, some smaller size screwdrivers, some number 4 3/8 inch metal screws, a number 4 drill bit and tap, and a metal tap for boring out threads. So since this isn't really like a home improvement channel, and for the sake of time, I'm going to take you through the steps that I'm doing here to bore out my lens board. First and foremost, you've got to get that lens board attached to a surface that you're okay drilling through a little bit. So I just took some pieces of 2x4, tied them together with some 3.5 inch screws, and then I secured the lens board down to those same 2x4s with some 1.5 inch little woodworking screws. That held it in place perfectly. Normally you can use something like a heavy vise or clamp, but that would actually take up too much area for what I was drilling out. Next step, I had to attach my hole saw to my power drill. The hole saw usually attaches via an arbor, which has this little starter bit. That starter bit has to be centered onto the lens board, and then carefully and slowly use your hole saw to start boring through. Make sure you're using a bimetal hole saw if you're working on something like aluminum. Aluminum cuts very easily, but you have to go low and slow. This isn't wood. Once I'm done cutting through that, which is kind of the eventual part, I had to hit it quite a bit. Once you're done with that, you have to file out those spare edges. This is not a precision tool like a CNC lathe. You will be cutting extra bits out and missing some parts. So I'm using the 8-inch half round file to kind of soften those edges a little bit and get out any extra bits. Once we're done there, we need to make sure we have a snug fit on the lens board, not something that's too snug and not something that's too loose, just enough for that flange to hold on. Once I've got that, I'm going to take my metal tap, my number 4, attach it to the thread borer, and I'm just using that to hammer little starter holes so I know where to drill for those holes that are going to attach the flange. Once I've got that, I'm going to put the number 4 bit on my drill and carefully drill that through. Now here you'll also probably want to have the lens board attached to something that can be drilled through, kind of like the previous step. And once you've got that done, comes one of the longest steps, and that's boring those threads carefully through the board. So the tap slowly etches those threads of the right size into the lens board. It's very important that you keep the tap level, and after you go 3/4 of a turn, go a 1/4 turn back. So 3/4 in, 1/4 turn out, and rinse, lather, repeat until you've got all 6 holes done. Once we've got that, add the flange. Make sure the screws go in flush. I'm using a flat-headed screw. If you use something that's raised, you might run into spacing issues with a lens this big, so after that, it went right on the lens board. I was pretty surprised. Okay, so just what is this monster lens that I'm working on? This lens is the Graf Variable, which started production in 1923. This is a lens designed specifically for pictorial use, but with a little bit of a twist. The front element of this lens can be spaced further from the rest of the front group to change the sharpness of the lens, as well as effective focal length. This model you see here is the second largest they made, the 16-inch to 18-inch, which was designed for work with 9x11 portrait cameras. With the barrel of this lens fully tightened, this lens is an 18-inch 457mm f4.5 that yields a dreamy soft focus look, and when you rotate the front barrel out into its sharp position, it gives you a 16-inch or 406mm f3.8. So I was waiting for just the right light to test out this big old lens. And by right light, I mean relatively flat and subdued light, because this lens is so fast at f3.8. If I want to actually attempt to use it wide open, I'm going to need a relatively slow photographic material, in today's case paper negatives, And I'm gonna need some pretty flat light because those paper negatives or any film that's gonna be that low speed is also gonna be pretty high contrast. In the case of paper negatives, we don't see anything but blue and green light and a little bit of ultraviolet. So if I'm shooting in a flatter scene where I don't really care about getting any detail in the sky, that's gonna be my best case scenario for using that paper without having to do anything like pre-flashing or modifying my exposure. I'm gonna rate that paper at ISO 4, and we're just gonna shoot around the backyard and see what we can get with it. As far as settings on the lens go, I'm gonna start with it in quote unquote sharp mode so I can see what it looks like at 3.8 there, and then I'm gonna rotate the element in and get the look when it's at its softer focus, which is an 18-inch f4.5. Actually, I'm gonna need to back up a little bit more. I'm so used to wider lenses for trees. Let's try something longer. Pretty tight frame. I like the way it looks. Let's see how our focus can go. Let's be a little more reasonable with our f-stop here. Let's go f8. Let's meter something out for f8. Get that bark. It's somewhere between 2.8 and 4. Greenery's at 5.6. Brightest highlights are at 16. Darkest shadows way in the distance are not quite 2.8. So we still have a pretty deep dynamic range, but I'm pretty much gonna throw out the sky exposure because it's not something that we can achieve even with this paper. So to get not my darkest shadow, but my good shadows with detail at around where my f-stop is at f8, that's gonna be about 2 seconds. Okay, close up my lens. I'm having a lot of fun with this lens cap thing. I can see why some photographers wear hats. All right, load up my paper. Go. Okay. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. That's not too bad. Try a vertical of the same shot. Lock her down. (1001), 1002. You know, one theme that tends to crop up a lot on this channel is the idea of contrast and controlling that with various means. We can do that with filtration, with exposure, with development, and eventually in printing as well. But isn't there more than just contrast? Well, when you have black and white, not so much. Contrast is kind of everything. The way you manipulate the colors, the way you manipulate how much light you're letting in, contrast is our only communication tool. We either have a lot of it or not a lot of it. In this case, we've got not a lot in the scene, but we've got a lot of contrast building capability within our medium, which is our paper negative. So we're gonna exploit that to get a really creative look. Kind of similar to what I did last week with the blue filter. So I've just done some really tight framing on the vine trellis and the little chairs here, and I'm gonna try for a wide open exposure. So on the sharp mode, that's at 3.8, and let's find what our dynamic range is. Darkest shadows, under 2.8. Brightest highlight in this scene, about f8, which is a pretty limited dynamic range. That's only about 3 f-stops across. So our darkest shadow with detail, coming in just under f4, which is great because we're at 3.8, and that's for 2 seconds. I may have to get a custom fitted lens cap though. That one is a bit on the bulkier side, and I don't want to like modify that one with tape or anything. All right, film holders in. All right, pull our slide, and here we go. Ready? 1001, 1002. Ah, so much fun. Let's rotate our barrel, get it into our soft focus mode. Ooh, those threads are farting. All right, let's check our focus. So again, if I did it right, I should be out of focus. Yep, everything's way dreamier. And if I pull my bellows back, essentially focusing for that longer focal length, my framing is not too different. It's a smidge tighter. All right, we are sharp. All right, now we have changed from f3.8 to f4.5, and this is going to impact our exposure. So I'm going to go about 2.5 seconds. Thousand one, 1002, 1000. All right, ready, and very good. All right, relax. So to wrap things up, the Graf Variable, it's a monster lens. It took a little bit more effort than I'm guessing a lot of folks at home would not want to go through to mount it to a lens board. And for everybody but maybe the bravest few or the cheapest few, I would recommend sending it off to a professional that does this all the time, that has the proper materials to do so. But if you want to take a whack at it, it can be worth it if you're doing a lot of stuff like this along the DIY lines. Just please be careful if you do. Wear some safety goggles, wear the gloves, do all the right things that you should. And if you have questions about it, ask a professional, ask a handyman, ask somebody before you dive right into it. I only dove into this because I had the tools already at home and I only needed to buy one extra thing to kind of get things rolling. As far as how the lens looks, I'm really infatuated with the Graf Variable. It's an interesting lens and kind of a two-in-one. I have two separate focal lengths with two kind of distinctive looks. They're both, I would say, on the soft focus end of the spectrum, but one is like a sharper soft focus and the other one is a very blooming highlights and everything just kind of melds together look. I also tried a few sheets of the RA4 color process and I don't know how much I really like it. It's definitely, it looks like something old-timey. And I used to think a lot of early color just had like these really crazy, exaggerated, saturated tones, but I think it really was because they were using glass that had this kind of blooming effect. So even if you had just a little bit of blush on your face or your lips, just like natural from blood, it would look like this crazy added thing on there. Oh, and by the way, this thing can fit on my Takahara, but I wouldn't dare do so. This lens weighs about half of what my 8x10 Takahara does. It's a two-hander through and through. Ooh, okay. It almost feels like it's going to pull down the front of this, but so far it hasn't. There was a few days between when I DIY'd it and when I got out in the field where it was kind of sitting on the camera just to see how it did. The board handled very well. Nothing came loose machining wise, so the threads are holding really strong, and this is just such an interesting lens. I think something like this would be at its best if you're using it in a pictorial manner. You're doing paper negatives, dry plates, collodion wet plates, hand coating your own emulsion, maybe trying some like J-Lane dry plates. I think that kind of process lends itself really well to a soft focus device like one of these. And it's a pretty pleasing look. So hopefully I'll have some more chances to get out in the field with this, maybe even this fall, and share the results with you guys at home. If you have any questions about this Graf Variable lens or what I was doing during the DIY process or just anything large format in general, you can always feel free to email me largeformatquestions@gmail.com. Thanks again for stopping by, and we'll catch you next time for more LFF.